I've beaten every Ark map on alpha difficulty as a solo player, and in this video, I'll be ranking all of Ark's bosses from easiest to hardest. Before we start, let's set some ground rules. 1. I'll be ranking the bosses based on how difficult they are to beat for a solo player. I'll mention if the boss gets exponentially easier with more players, but it will not affect my rankings. 2. Cheese strats will be mentioned, but will also not affect my rankings. 3. I'll only take into account strats available for the map the boss is on. And 4. I'll be ranking the alpha difficulty of these bosses, but will take into account the lower tiers if they're required to beat the alpha. Without further ado, sit back and relax, and let's get into the easiest boss in Ark. The Megapithecus is a complete joke of a boss fight. The main reason for this is because there's so many viable approaches to beat the boss, and there's almost nothing that stands out as an extra challenge with this fight. The Megapithecus has okay stats, but there's nothing that makes this boss particularly challenging. You can beat him with the widest variety of strategies of any arena boss. The Gigantopithecus that he spawns are not nearly as threatening as some of the other boss's support creatures. The monkey is just the easiest boss in Ark, plain and simple. The only thing between you and a Megapithecus trophy is the pitfall on the side of the bridge, and potentially a rogue boulder throw killing you off your mount. If you simply stay back, don't fight on the bridge, and bring a freer curry for the freezing temperature, you'll be prepared for all the challenges this arena and boss can throw at you. The Desert Titan is the easiest Titan out of the 4 Extinction has to offer by a significant margin. Like all the other Titans, the fight occurs in the open world, which removes the arena restrictions that most bosses have. The major arena restrictions are the creature cap of 20, max drag weight cap that prevents you from using certain things like gigas for bosses, and the time restraints. The only 2 challenges for the Desert Titan is the lightning stun attack and the fact that it never lands on the ground. The strategy I always use against it is just to put a Giga on the back of a Quetzal and then fly behind the Titan and bite it, because the Desert Titan's bite range can't hit you if you're behind it, so this is a relatively safe strategy. You can also just use a mech from the ground and shoot it out of the air if you want. This method is extremely safe and very easy, it just takes a long time. With the amount of versatility and available strategies, the bite from the Desert Titan being almost impossible to get hit by, as well as the fight not having any restraints in regards to time, creatures, or arena at all, it just makes the fight super easy compared to almost everything in the game. If the Desert Titan wasn't a flying boss, it would be in last by a mile. The Manticore is an easy fight. It has weak stats, an arena that offers very little in terms of added difficulty, and allows flyers into the arena. There's 3 things about the Manticore that make it slightly harder than the bosses I've previously mentioned. The first challenge in this fight is that the Manticore is able to fly while the fight is on a timer. Flying around can lead to stallouts in the fight that cause the timer to be a real concern if you're unprepared to deal with it. The 2 other challenges here are the rock golem spawning and the torpor that the boss inflicts. The torpor is substantial, and if you aren't careful, it can definitely knock out your creatures and cost you the fight. This knockout risk, plus the fact that it flies around the map the entire fight, leads to some level of risk because you can get timed out. I know that you can bring flyers into the arena, but even using wyverns in this boss fight has some level of risk because getting knocked out is still a potential threat. I initially planned to have this right at the bottom, but the fact that it has some type of lose condition puts it at least above the bottom 2. The Forest Titan is the second easiest Titan on Extinction. It's substantially harder than the Desert Titan because of its variety of attacks and way higher base stats. First of all, the Forest Titan is able to grab you off of mounts with its vines, which can be a serious inconvenience during the fight. It's also capable of putting roots around your tames, which prevents them from moving and is extremely obnoxious. Using the Forest Wyverns that the boss spawns against the Titan requires skill, but if used effectively can make the battle a lot easier. The Forest Wyverns are temporarily rideable after they land, and you can use the Fire Breath to destroy the roots and burn the Titan, which does great damage because he's a giant tree. This might have been the toughest mini Titan if it was still able to pull players out of the mech, but since they removed its ability to do that, the fight has become a lot less dangerous. Just riding a mech and using a Giga army completely stomps this boss. It's also way too slow to throw you off guard, which is also a big factor in why this fight is so easy. The Ice Titan is definitely the toughest out of the 3 mini Titans. It comes with a diverse moveset, a massive jump that lets it close distance very easily, and strong stats. The Ice Titan comes equipped with a huge ice sphere projectile that freezes creatures hit by it. It has an ice breath that also freezes creatures, and it has an ice spike projectile which does ludicrous amounts of damage. These abilities are simply stronger than anything the Forest or Desert Titan can dish out. There's a reason this is the must-tame Titan for killing the King Titan. The Forest Titan may be tankier and also may be a must-tame for the King Titan, but it is slower and does less damage, which poses less of a threat to the style of approach that works best against these bosses, which is just a Giga or Kartra spam strategy while you sit back safely in a mech. That is really the only way to gauge these non-arena boss fights on difficulty in my opinion, because all of them can just be beaten by being insanely overprepared. Extinction is coming to Ark Ascended next week, and I have multiple videos planned about the new map, so make sure to like and subscribe to not miss those. If you have any topics you want covered about the new map, leave a comment down below and I may just make a video on it. You can also message me on my Discord with suggestions, and while you're at it, why not join the Ark 2 giveaway that ends this Saturday the 14th. The link is in the description, so don't miss out. If you're watching the video after the giveaway ended, don't worry. I'll be hosting more giveaways in the future as well as community events which will have prizes, so I'd recommend to join the server anyway. Motor is pretty easy to take down on the Gamma and Beta difficulties. The Alpha, however, is definitely a notable step up. Against the lower tiers of the boss, simply using an army of Megalodons with a Bazzi to tank works wonders with little to no trouble. On Alpha, however, anything besides Moses or Tuzos is pretty ineffective. The limited amount of strategies that work make this boss tougher than the bottom of the barrel bosses. Of course, Motor being underwater presents a unique challenge as well, and actually fitting 20 Moses or Tuzos into the mission terminal bubble is a logistical nightmare, but the fight is extremely straightforward once you become prepared. Annoying prep, arena creature cap of 20, limited viable strategies, and the unique underwater environment make this straightforward fight pretty tough. The Broodmother is the second hardest island guardian in Ark. Let's start with the things that make the Broodmother hard. She does a stupid amount of damage, has decent health and speed, and the Araneos she spawns inflict a slowing effect that can prove to be a real hindrance to your army. The Broodmother on Alpha difficulty is very lethal with a suboptimal approach. Even though it is weak to Megatheriums, which is definitely the best strategy for this boss, it can still kill an army of Megatheriums or Rexes fairly easily if you don't pump a lot of health mutations and levels into your army. There's also water in this arena, so Spinos will get the hydrated buff and can maul this thing as well. This boss is just very straightforward and is not challenging in any unique way. It's a tough boss with a lot of aspects that make it easier. From the Araneos buffing Megatheriums to being the most cheesable fight in the entirety of Ark due to being able to jump up on top of the arena with a Percoptodon and shotgun down the boss with zero risk, the Broodmother simply isn't on the same tier as the top 9. If I was counting cheese strats, the Broodmother would absolutely have been dead last on this list. The Crystal Wyvern Queen is the first boss that I consider to be genuinely tough on this list. First of all, this boss spawns all the Crystal Wyverns as support creatures for the fight. These Crystal Wyverns definitely aren't a complete nightmare, but they're way tougher than spiders or monkeys. The boss also flies, has a diverse range of attacks because of it having multiple breath attacks, and has a fairly high health pool for a flying boss. This fight would be ridiculously annoying if you weren't allowed to bring flyers into the fight yourself, but having this capability opens the door to a lot of extremely effective strategies for handling the Crystal Wyvern Queen. A strong army of any type of Crystal Wyvern, Blood Wyverns especially, or even just a strong army of RGs can take down this boss with relative ease due to it having worse base stats than most of the game's bosses. It's just barely easier than 8th in my opinion. The only reason I had it here is because you can't get killed off the back of your mount in this fight, which is a huge thing for these harder bosses. The Dinopithecus King is extremely underrated in terms of difficulty by most players. It has really strong stats, summons Dinopithecus being carried by Cinemacrops, and Dinopithecus on a Margosaurus, which can all present different challenges and be annoying to deal with. The boss has a vantage point where he can pelt you with projectiles, is extremely mobile with his high jump and fast speed, and can just feel generally like an oppressive boss to deal with because of how much is throwing at you at once. With all that being said, the real threat in this fight is the creatures that he spawns. Dinopithecus and a Margosaurus are strong and can fight at a distance with projectiles of their own. The Dinopithecus that are being carried by Cinemacrops can also damage you on a mount, which is extremely dangerous in any boss fight, especially this one when you have so much to worry about. Any boss that's able to damage you while you're on a mount instantly becomes way more difficult because of this threat. The Dinopithecus King is definitely a tough fight due to the variety of threats and the speed that the boss comes with, on top of its decent stats. Fenrir Sulfur is super strong. It has strong base stats, the Fenrirs it spawns are powerful and come in huge quantities, and he has some very powerful attacks. Fenrir Sulfur has 3 diverse attacks that are all strong and add challenge to the fight. His Wolf Projectile does ridiculously high damage, his Ice Breath does splash damage, and Fenrir Sulfur also comes equipped with the ability to spawn a ring of rocks and spikes around it to protect it. The Wolf attack especially can just straight up one-shot you unless you're extremely kitted, even if you're on a mount, so definitely avoid that move at all costs. The mini Fenrirs are the main challenge in this fight though, for sure. They're strong, and crazy amounts of them spawn. Alright, let's talk about what makes Fenrir Sulfur easier than the top 6. This arena is actually designed in a way that favors the player, because it has elevations that can be used to avoid the smaller Fenrirs, as well as water that can buff Shadowmanes and Spinos. This makes those creatures extremely viable here, and the regular Rex and UD armies work just fine as well. Rockwell Prime is a tough fight because of the player's involvement in it. Having to go into the exomech to complete certain stages, as well as having to navigate all those tentacles that shoot projectiles on foot, puts the player in more danger than any fight I've previously mentioned. Being in the front lines like this is only something that 2 of the bosses in the game have, and it makes dying so much easier because you're removed from the buffer of having a really strong mount to be on the back of. With all that being said, the actual stats on Rockwell Prime and the attacks being dished out here are not super threatening. He's definitely weaker in a vacuum than a lot of the game's bosses. The boss is also just a skill curve boss, where if you get good at it, he would be significantly lower on this list. The fact is that it has a genuine skill curve, and that places it higher on my list because I think that most bosses in the game are pretty repetitive in terms of send in the Rexes, roar on the Yudi, so yeah, I just have it at 6. Also, if you're playing on console, I've heard that this boss crashes a lot, so that might make the boss even harder because if you can't fight the boss, it's pretty tough to beat. Rockwell is the most overrated boss in terms of difficulty in Ark, and it isn't even close. If you don't have Cactus Broth, this fight gets really tough because of the Reapers, but luckily this isn't a problem. He's not a complete cakewalk with Cactus Broth, but is definitely nowhere near the top 4. For those of you who are commenting for the 3rd video now that you can't get Cactus Broth on Aberration, you are wrong. Mini guide time. If you go into the Glowtail cave and find the hidden drop behind this rock, you can actually find thorny dragon saddles or straight up Cactus Broth in this drop. And if you get thorny dragon saddles, just go to an industrial grinder and grind down the saddle and then grind down the clay. It will give you cactus sap and you can make Cactus Broth on Aberration. Once you're fighting Rockwell with Cactus Broth, the only challenge in this fight is the timer. Rockwell has a ridiculous amount of HP, but if you have a strong pump shotgun and are optimally prepared for the fight, it's not very dangerous at all. This boss just requires very optimal preparation that most people don't know about, and without that preparation, this boss is almost impossible to beat in time as a solo player. So I've decided it deserves to be in the top 5, but no higher. The dragon is very hard. The best method for taking him on is by using Deinonychus, but unfortunately, these don't spawn naturally on the island, so that method is completely ruled out in these rankings. The dragon has a few things that make the fight exceptionally difficult. First of all, the arena has lava everywhere that can easily ruin your day if you don't approach the boss patiently. The dragon also flies around, which is definitely a pain to deal with because it just burns clock on the timer, but once he lands for a first time, generally, you can keep him from flying off if you swarm him properly. Thirdly, he summons Pteranodons and Dimorphodons to assist him, which may not seem dangerous, but the Dimorphs can easily kill you off your mount if you aren't careful. Lastly, he has a Flame Breath, which does a significant percent of your creature's HP as fixed damage to carnivores, which makes using herbivores almost mandatory to not get eviscerated. The dragon rounds out all of these challenges with his insanely strong stats compared to other flying bosses. He's easily the hardest guardian, and other flying bosses in Ark are so weak because of how much complaining that came from this fight. The Overseer is really tough. He has very high health and takes the form of all 3 guardians during the fight, so you really need to be ready to be adaptable. There's also flying attack drones and tanky defense units to deal with during your fight, which are also fairly dangerous. The attack drones do damage to the player while they're mounted, so focusing those when they spawn is a must. And the Overseer is one of the fastest bosses in the game, so there's a lot of time spent chasing the boss around while these support robots can chip away at your army. Although the fight is tough, there's a cheese strat that makes it extremely easy to pull off. Simply using a tech suit can place you on the roof of the arena where only the attack drones can reach you. This strat works because the timer in the Overseer fight doesn't actually matter. The timer on this fight is simply for the tech cave portion, so this strat being ridiculously slow doesn't actually punish you. Speaking of the tech cave, that is the actual reason this boss is so high, because the tech cave is unquestionably harder than the Overseer fight if you're not experienced. The Yudi's Fear Roar that scares your creatures into lava, Prolovias that knock you off your creatures, narrow pathways to navigate your army through, and extremely strong and high-level creatures make this cave a nightmare if you aren't used to using one of the many skill-demanding skips to get through this while avoiding the creatures. The King Titan on Alpha difficulty is ridiculously easy. If you have some practice, the Megamech can simply 1v1 it. With that being said, to fight the King Titan on Alpha, you are forced to go through the gauntlet of the Gamma and Beta difficulty first. Doing all 3 of these fights on a single-player world is the hardest I've ever grinded in PvE. First of all, you need to fight all of the mini titans to get the trophies to summon each tier of the King Titan, which are all grindy because you need so many corrupted hearts. Both the Gamma and the Beta tiers of the King Titan demand you to sacrifice tens to hundreds of gigas or karchas just to get through them, and then you need to breed up more gigas or karchas just to do the next tier of the boss. It's just ridiculous how annoying it is. Even though there's no limit to the amount of creatures you can bring to the fight versus the King Titan, he's simply too powerful to be considered anything but difficult. If this list was ranking how tough bosses are for multiple players, the King Titan would take the top spot because he does not get noticeably easier regardless of how many players are fighting him. Also, one more thing, it is completely rigged when he heals half his health back and gets pulled back to the center of the arena when he takes 3 steps to the right. Like, please stop doing that, you have 2 million HP, solo players don't want to have to deal with that stuff, so annoying. The King Titan is obviously the strongest being in all of Ark, but the fight is not actively designed to punish solo players, so it lands in second on my list as opposed to first. I'm hoping the Dreadnoughtus is really strong and able to beat the King Titan super easily, so I never have to deal with the grindiness of fighting this guy ever again in my entire life. The Alpha Master Controller is an absolute nightmare to fight as a solo player. Don't get me wrong, this boss fight is hard regardless of player count, but it's literally designed to be almost impossible to beat as a solo player. This is the second fight, like Rockwell Prime, where you have to be on foot for a lot of the time, but this time, the threats that are being thrown at you are way more lethal, and you have to be on foot for a larger portion of the fight. The code keys that you need to grab to defeat the boss can only be collected on foot, and you need to collect these keys when there are many threats like Gigas, Reapers, Rexes, and others trying to stop you. I personally think that this fight will be modified in Ark Ascended because it's completely impossible without pumping movement speed on your character. This fight is just a huge skill test and demands extremely thorough preparation and strategy to tackle it. The Master Controller, like the Dragon, led to easier versions of the same style of fight being made in the future because of how much complaining that came from players about it. If this list was ranking difficulty for multiple players to take on the boss, the Master Controller would be second only to the King Titan. Well, that's my list. If you enjoyed this video, I'm sure you'll enjoy my ranking of every map in the game's difficulty, which is linked on screen now. See you there. Bye!